In this emotionally charged narrative, Nancy recounts the journey of her once perfect family life, full of warmth and affection, as it gradually unravels. As she grows older, her close relationship with her father takes on a new, uncomfortable complexity. The tension quietly escalates, with subtle gestures hinting at something deeper, ultimately leading to a devastating confrontation when her mother begins to suspect that things are not as they seem. The story blends joyful memories with painful truths, ultimately spiraling into heartbreak and loss as the family dynamic crumbles. Nancy's struggle to process her emotions and cope with the chaos around her paints a powerful picture of love, confusion, and the tragic outcomes of unspoken realities. If you're not already subscribed, I recommend subscribing and turning on notifications to avoid missing any videos. I grew up in a peaceful home, surrounded by love and warmth, until everything changed in ways I never could have predicted. My name is N, and I was raised in what I thought was the perfect family. My father was the ideal provider, strong, hardworking, and always present for me, offering guidance and support. My mother, with her gentle nature, was nurturing and organized, keeping our home running smoothly, from the meals we shared to the unconditional love that bound us as a family. To an outsider, my parents seemed like the perfect match, a couple who had overcome the challenges so common in modern relationships. As I grew older, I idolized my father. He was my hero in every way. In my younger years, I would eagerly follow him around the house, excited to help with his various tasks, whether it was fixing the car, mowing the lawn, or diving into the numerous DIY projects he started but rarely finished. Those moments were filled with laughter and bonding, creating a foundation of trust and companionship between us. Even as I entered my teenage years and our relationship evolved, our bond remained strong, though it had taken on a different tone. Our conversations grew deeper, moving beyond the light-hearted banter of my childhood. We began to talk about serious matters, life's complexities, my dreams, and sometimes topics that seemed too personal for a typical father-daughter relationship. I never found it strange to me. My dad was simply someone I could trust completely, a confidant who was always there to listen, especially when my mom was busy with her responsibilities or too tired to engage in deep conversations. Our connection was unique, something I cherished, distinct from the structured and nurturing relationship I had with my mother. I remained blissfully unaware of the subtle shifts in our dynamic until one particular day when I started noticing something unsettling. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, and my mum had gone to visit a friend, leaving my dad and me alone in the house. At first, there was nothing unusual about the situation. We had spent time together like this countless times before without issue. But that day, something felt different. The way he looked at me had changed, and his smile carried an intensity that seemed unfamiliar. It was as if he was seeing me not just as his daughter, but as something more, something deeper. I initially brushed off the feeling, convincing myself that I was imagining things. After all, my dad had always been caring and kind, never crossing any boundaries. But as the days passed, small, seemingly innocent moments began to add up: the way he brushed my hair away from my face when I spoke, the hugs that lingered a little too long, or how often he sought out my company. Nothing inappropriate ever happened, but the tension between us was undeniable, even though it was hard to describe. It was subtle, yet very real. I started questioning my own reality. Was I reading too much into things? Was I simply misinterpreting a natural shift in our relationship? Still, a persistent part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Soon it became apparent that I wasn't the only one noticing these changes. My mother's behavior started to shift as well. She became more distant, and I could sense her growing suspicion as she observed the interactions between my father and me. Her eyes, once filled with warmth, now held a shadow of doubt. Despite the growing tension in the air, I refused to believe that anything was fundamentally wrong. Our once loving home was slowly transforming into a place filled with tension, silence, and glances that seemed to communicate more than we were willing to admit. The foundation of our family life was shifting, and I found myself caught in the middle of confusion and fear, unsure of how to deal with this new unsettling reality. Even though I desperately wanted to cling to the normalcy of our household, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was trapped in a situation I didn't fully understand. As the weeks went by, the atmosphere in our home grew more strained, almost suffocating. My mother's once warm looks had turned into cold, distant stares, her expressions growing harder with each passing day. My father too began acting differently. His attention toward me was becoming more focused in subtle ways that were hard to explain. It was in the small, almost imperceptible gestures, how he would stand just a little too close during our conversations, or how he seemed to find reasons to stay near me even when there was no clear need. This behavior unsettled me, but I kept pushing those feelings down. After all, he was my father, he would never cross any lines, right? One evening, shortly after dinner, my mum unexpectedly stood up and said she was going out. This was out of character for her, as she usually told us where she was going before she left. Still, neither my dad nor I questioned her sudden exit. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, I noticed an undeniable shift in my dad's mood. He seemed almost relieved, a flicker of excitement crossing his face as he suggested we watch a movie together. I tried to act normal, but being alone with him now felt different, as though an invisible boundary between us was fading. As we settled on the couch, with the movie playing in the background, I could feel his gaze fixed on me. But it wasn't the usual fatherly look that brought comfort and safety, it was a stare that made me acutely aware of myself. My heart started racing, though I couldn't fully understand why. I forced myself to keep my eyes on the screen, trying to ignore the thickening tension in the air. Then, suddenly, my dad leaned in closer and placed his hand on my shoulder. At first glance, it seemed like an innocent gesture, but the weight of it felt heavy, almost oppressive. His hand stayed there longer than it should have, the warmth of his touch seeping through my shirt and into my skin. I stiffened, frozen by confusion and an instinctive urge to pull away. But he didn't remove his hand. Instead, he turned slightly to face me, his face uncomfortably close to mine. "Nancy," he said softly, his voice low and almost hesitant, "you know I'm always here for you, right? You can talk to me about anything." I nodded, but my throat tightened, making it hard to speak. There was something in his tone that felt disturbingly different from the fatherly concern I was used to. I wanted to believe he was just being the caring dad I knew, but deep down, a part of me felt uneasy. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to steer the conversation back to familiar ground. He held my gaze for a long moment, his eyes searching mine as if weighing something heavy on his mind. Then, just as quickly as the tension had built, he pulled his hand away and smiled a smile that felt hollow, not quite reaching his eyes. "Of course, everything's fine," he said abruptly, standing up from the couch. "I'm just going to check on something in the garage." As he left the room, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My mind was spinning with conflicting thoughts. Was I imagining things? Misinterpreting innocent actions? I shook my head, trying to push away the troubling doubts that crowded my mind. Yet no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore how my body reacted when he was near, or the unsettling feeling that something wasn't right between us. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself replaying the evening's events over and over in my head. I didn't want to believe that anything inappropriate was happening. After all, my dad hadn't done anything explicitly wrong, at least, nothing overt. But the uneasy feeling in my gut told me that something was shifting between us, and it wasn't for the better. The next morning, I noticed my mum seemed even more distant than the day before. The air in the house felt thick with unsaid words and unresolved tension. She barely spoke to my dad, and when she did talk to me, her words were short, clipped, and missing the warmth they used to hold. It was as if she was wrestling with something significant but wasn't ready to confront it openly yet. I caught her glancing at me out of the corner of her eye, her expression tight with unasked questions that hung in the air like a heavy fog. As the days passed, the growing distance between my parents became more obvious. They spoke less and less, their voices rarely rising above a whisper, and even when they were in the same room, they barely touched or showed any signs of affection. Our home, once full of laughter and light, now felt stifling and heavy, as though it was caving in on itself. The cracks in their relationship, once subtle, were now widening into deep rifts, and I felt completely powerless, unsure of how to fix what was tearing us apart. Then one afternoon, while my dad was at work, my mum approached me. Her face was tight with worry, and her voice, usually firm, was surprisingly soft. "Nancy," she began, hesitation clear in her tone as she searched for the right words. "Has anything been happening between you and your father?" "Anything?" Strange, my heart sank at her question, hitting me like a blow to the stomach. Was she really accusing me of something? Did she think I was involved in whatever was causing this rift between them? My mind raced as I struggled to find the right words, trying not to betray my confusion. "No, Mum. Nothing's going on," I replied quickly, though a small, nagging doubt lingered in the back of my mind, making me question whether my words were entirely true. Though nothing concrete had occurred, There was an unsettling tension beneath the surface, a discomfort that both of us could sense but struggled to articulate. My mother studied me closely, her eyes sharp as if trying to pierce through my defenses and uncover the truth. After a long silence, she sighed deeply and nodded, though her expression revealed that my reassurances hadn't fully convinced her. "Okay," she whispered. "I just wanted to be sure." As she walked away, a heavy weight settled in my chest, a realization that the cracks in our family dynamic were no longer hidden, they were glaring, threatening to tear us apart. Deep down, I felt a gnawing certainty that something terrible was approaching. The days following my mother's quiet confrontation felt as though I was living in a pressure cooker, emotions swirling beneath a fragile surface. My father, once a comforting presence, became overwhelming, his attention almost suffocating. On the other hand, my mother grew increasingly distant, avoiding me altogether. It was clear that we were no longer a functioning family, rather, we were three strangers living in the same house, separated by unspoken words and invisible barriers. I felt trapped between my father's actions and my mother's silent suspicions, torn and isolated. Then, one fateful evening, everything fell apart. It was late, long after dinner, and I had already gone to my room for the night when I heard my parents arguing in the living room. Their voices were low but filled with anger, slicing through the stillness of the night like a knife. At first I tried to ignore it, pulling the covers over my head and hoping the fight would blow over like it had in the past. But the tension in their voices kept drawing me in, twisting my stomach with dread. Unable to resist, I crept out of bed and quietly opened my door, just enough to hear their heated exchange. Their words were sharper now, cutting through the darkness. "You think I don't see what's happening?" My mother's voice was cold, though beneath it was an unmistakable tremble of anger. "The way you've been acting around her, the way you've been acting around her, the way you've been avoiding me, do you think I'm blind?" "Linda, stop it. You're making something out of nothing," my father replied, his tone steady but defensive. "She's our daughter. Nothing's happening." "Don't lie to me," Richard, my mother shot back, her voice trembling with barely controlled fury. "I see how you look at her. And I've noticed how she looks at you too." My heart sank even further. Did she really think I was involved in this? Did she believe I had any part in this twisted situation? My father's voice softened, almost pleading. "I would never hurt her," he said quietly. "You know me. I love her, but not like that." Not like that. My mother's voice cracked, filled with desperation and anguish. "I don't know who you are anymore, and I don't know what's going on between the two of you, but it's not normal, it's not right." I could hear the unmistakable tremor of tears in her voice, and it sent a shiver through me, tightening my chest as if a weight had settled on it. This was the moment everything I knew began to fall apart. Realizing I had to step in before things spiraled further out of control, I left my room, heart pounding, and walked down the dim hallway toward the living room. A sense of dread coiled in my stomach as I approached. Both of them turned to look at me, startled by my sudden appearance. Their faces were frozen in shock, guilt, and surprise, their emotions tangled together like threads in a frayed tapestry. "Mom, Dad, stop," I whispered, my voice cutting through the suffocating tension like a knife. "Nothing has happened. Dad hasn't done anything, and neither have I." My mother's eyes narrowed, a storm of suspicion and pain swirling within them. "But you know something's wrong, don't you, Nancy? You felt it too." Her words hung in the air, heavy with desperation for answers. I hesitated, struggling under the weight of her gaze, and that moment of uncertainty seemed to confirm her worst fears. I could see the flicker of betrayal in her eyes, and it struck me with a sharp, painful ache I hadn't expected. "I don't know what's happening," I admitted, my voice shaky with emotion, "but it's not what you think. Dad and I were just..." I trailed off, searching for the words to make sense of the situation, but they eluded me. My father stood there silently, a heavy presence in the room. His face was pale, his features drawn tight with regret. The vibrant energy he once carried was gone, replaced by a hollow expression of a man who had lost everything without realizing how it had happened. My mother stepped closer to me, her voice trembling with both emotion and resolve. "Nancy, I love you, but I can't ignore what I've seen. There's something between you two that shouldn't be there. It's not your fault, but it's not okay either." Her words cut through me like daggers, striking at the heart of our family. Tears blurred my vision as the reality of the situation crashed over me like a tidal wave. I hadn't intended for any of this to happen. I hadn't even fully understood what was unfolding. Whatever strange connection had developed between my father and me, it was something I hadn't asked for, something I didn't want, and now it was threatening to destroy everything I loved. Finally, my father found his voice, his tone hoarse and desperate. "Linda, please, I never meant for any of this. I love you. I love both of you. But things haven't been right for a while, and I don't know how we got here." His eyes desperately searched my mother's, silently pleading for a hint of forgiveness, some glimmer of hope. But my mother slowly shook her head, her voice steady, yet tinged with deep sorrow. "It's too late, Richard. I can't trust you anymore. I can't trust this family anymore." Her words landed like a final verdict, enveloping us in a suffocating sense of closure. The weight of her statement pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe, as I struggled to grasp the full reality of what was happening. In the days that followed, my mother silently packed her belongings, the sound of zippers and the rustle of clothing echoing through the now empty spaces of our home. She didn't say goodbye or even glance back. It was as if she had already mourned the end of our family long before she walked out the door, sealing the break with a finality that left my heart aching. My dad tried to apologize, tried to explain, but there was nothing left to say. The damage was done, and no words could piece together the shattered remains of our lives. For a while, I stayed with my dad, seeking comfort in the familiar surroundings of the house, but nothing felt the same. The unspoken tension that had lingered between us for months became a constant presence, a quiet, uncomfortable reminder of the boundary that had been crossed, even though neither of us fully understood how or why it had happened. Eventually, I decided to leave, desperate to escape the suffocating weight of the past that loomed over me like a dark shadow. My relationship with my father remained strained, a fragile bond overshadowed by the silence of things left unsaid. As for my mother, she never really forgave me, or him, or the situation that had upended our world. Our once peaceful home had been replaced by a stifling silence, louder than any argument ever could be. It was in that silence that I began to understand something. Sometimes what destroys a family isn't the dramatic, obvious betrayals, but the subtle, quiet cracks, the ones that go unnoticed until it's too late to fix them. Small moments of neglect can pile up, creating a divide too wide to bridge. Years passed, and though the pain of what happened eventually dulled, it never completely disappeared. My parents divorced, and I found myself trapped between a rift that could never be healed. I tried to move on, to build a life away from the shadows of that broken home, but sometimes I'd find myself thinking back to those key moments. The tension that lingered unspoken, the words we never said, and I'd wonder if I could have done something differently, something that might have changed the course of all our lives. I never brought up that night with my dad again. We still talk, of course, but there's a distance between us that feels impossible to close, a chasm created by the events of that fateful evening. My mother remarried, and though we maintain a semblance of communication, there is still that lingering suspicion, the unshakable feeling of betrayal that hasn't entirely faded from our interactions. In the end, our family didn't fall apart because of some scandalous affair or a blatant act of betrayal. It crumbled due to a quiet erosion of trust, a slow breakdown that left us all fractured. The boundaries that once defined our relationships blurred, and in that haziness, something precious was lost, something we could never reclaim. Perhaps that is the real tragedy, not the affair that never happened, but the love and connection we couldn't hold on to, slipping through our fingers like grains of sand, lost forever to the tides of time. Thank you so much for being part of this journey with us today. As we close, I encourage you to take a moment to reflect on what we've discussed. What lessons or insights stood out to you the most? What new understanding or inspiration will you carry forward into your life? I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please share in the comments below one specific takeaway from this video and how you plan to apply it in your own life. Your reflections not only enrich our community but also inspire others who may be walking a similar path. If you enjoyed this video and found it meaningful, I invite you to share your thoughts by leaving a comment, and don't forget to click that like button. Your support helps us reach more people with these important messages of hope and faith. And remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more uplifting content that will guide you through life's challenges and celebrate the blessings that surround us. Thank you for being here today, and I look forward to connecting with you in the comments.